I was standing at that stump the way I'd stood at it maybe 1,000 times, and for the first time in 3 years, I was not alone there. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a man who believes easily. 14 years of managing 600 acres of wooded Ozark highland teaches you to account for what you see, to find the practical reason before you reach for any other kind. I have spent most of my adult life doing exactly that. So what I'm about to tell you, I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count, and I have not been able to make it fit into anything ordinary. I've stopped trying. To understand what I was standing there facing that November evening, I need to go back about 3 years, maybe a little more. The property sits on a wooded ridge in the Ozark Highlands. 600 acres of mixed hardwood and shortleaf pine with 2 seasonal creeks and a bluff face on the north end that drops about 40 feet to a dry creek bed. The owner lives out of state. He bought it for hunting, comes out maybe twice a year, and has always left the day-to-day management to me. I moved into the caretaker's cabin 14 years ago when I was 38 years old, and the agreement was simple enough. Keep the roads passable, maintain the cabin and the 2 outbuildings, monitor the fence line and the timber stands, and report anything that needed the owner's attention. I had been doing handyman and property maintenance work my whole adult life, so the work itself was not new. What was new was the scale of it and the quiet. It was a particular kind of quiet, not the kind that makes a man nervous, the kind that after a year or two starts to feel like a presence of its own, something that keeps its own company alongside yours. I grew into it the way you grow into a good pair of boots. The first winter I learned which corners of the cabin held heat and which ones leaked it, and I learned the sound of the timber settling under snow, a slow ticking through the rafters at night that could fool a man into thinking he had company. By the second spring, I knew which morning of the year the wood thrush would come back to the hollow below the south fence, and I had begun to feel, in a way I would not have admitted out loud, that the land was reading me back. Ruth came 3 years after I moved in. We had known each other off and on for a long time, and one autumn she drove up the ridge road with 2 boxes of kitchen things and a cast-iron skillet, and that was more or less that. She took to the property the way some people take to a place they have been looking for, without knowing they were looking. She learned the deer paths before I did. She could tell you which tree the barred owls used in September, and which one they shifted to by January. She kept a garden on the south slope that produced more than 2 people could eat, and gave the rest away to anybody who would take it. She had a way of standing at the kitchen window in the early morning with her coffee in both hands, looking out at the timber that I came to think of as her form of prayer, though she would have laughed at me for using that word. The apple stump was her idea. About 11 years ago, she started carrying apple slices down to the flat granite rock at the wood's edge every evening around dusk, whatever apples she had going soft on the counter. She'd lay them out in a small fan shape and come back up to the porch. She called it feeding the quiet. She wasn't sentimental about it in a showy way. She just said the deer came down at last light and they might as well have something for their trouble. I used to watch from the porch. The deer did come. Not every night, but most nights. Ruth would nod at them like they were neighbors who had arrived on time. Sometimes she would stay out longer than she needed to, just standing in the dusk with her hands in the pockets of her jacket, and I would watch her from the porch and feel something settle in my chest that I had not known was unsettled until it settled. She died 3 years ago in early November. A short illness, the kind that moves faster than the doctors expect and faster than you are prepared for. She was in the hospital 11 days. I drove the ridge road twice a day for those 11 days, and on the 12th day I drove it once and came back alone. I am not going to spend a long time on the months after that. because the honest truth is, I don't have very clear memories of them. I managed the property the way you manage anything when you are not fully present for it, by routine. I made my inspection rounds. I kept the roads gravelled. I filed my quarterly reports to the owner. I fed Pepper, my brindle hound, who was 8 years old at the time and had the good sense not to ask anything of me I wasn't able to give. What I did not notice for a long time was that I was still carrying apple slices to the stump. I can't tell you exactly when it started or when I became aware of it. Somewhere in those first weeks after Ruth died, the habit had settled into me without my choosing it. I would find myself at the counter with a knife and an apple before I had consciously decided anything, and I would walk down to the stump and lay the slices out and come back up. The walk down was about 140 paces. I had counted them once without meaning to, the way a man counts steps when he has nothing else to count. I did not call it anything. I did not think about it while I did it. It was just what happened at dusk. If you had asked me in those months why I was still doing it, I don't know what I would have said. Probably nothing. Probably I would have changed the subject and found something that needed checking on the south fence line. The knife I used was the same one she had used. I kept it in the drawer to the left of the sink, the way she had kept it, and I sharpened it every Sunday on the same whetstone she had used, and I did not let myself think about why I was being careful about the order of those small actions. My son Dale and I had not spoken much since the funeral. That was my doing more than his. He had driven up for the service and stayed 3 days, and somewhere in those 3 days I had run out of words and he had run out of patience for the silence. And by the time he left, we had said goodbye in the driveway without looking at each other directly. He called twice in the 2 months that followed. I answered both times and kept both conversations short, not out of anger but out of a kind of exhaustion that I did not know how to explain and did not try. After that, the calls stopped. I told myself he was busy. He had his own life. He did not need to be managing his father's grief on top of it. I was aware, in the way you are aware of a tooth that is not quite hurting yet, that I had made a choice I could not easily undo. I did not examine it. I put my attention on the property, on Pepper, on the 600 acres that needed what they always needed, regardless of what I was carrying. If you found yourself in a season like that one, you probably know what I mean. The work doesn't stop requiring you just because you have stopped being fully available. By the time the first autumn arrived after Ruth died, I had settled into something that looked like a functional life from a distance. I kept the cabin clean enough. I cooked simple meals. I took Pepper out every morning and every evening and let the walking do what walking does. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with my plate in front of me for 20 minutes before I remembered I had not picked up the fork. There were mornings I stood in the doorway of the spare room, where Ruth's coat still hung on the hook behind the door, and just looked at the coat without going in. I am not telling you these things for sympathy. I am telling you so you understand the shape of the man who walked down to the stump every evening and did not ask himself why. It was in that second autumn, 2 years after Ruth died and 1 year before what I'm telling you about, that I first noticed something was eating the apples before the deer got to them. It took me a while to register it as unusual because my mind was not particularly sharp about unusual things at that point. I noticed only that the deer seemed to be arriving at the stump and finding it already empty, which was not something that had happened when Ruth was doing the laying out, and not something that had happened in my first year of doing it. Deer are not early evening animals in November on that ridge. They come at last light, not before. My first explanation was raccoons. Raccoons will eat anything, and they are not shy about doing it in daylight if they are hungry enough. I started going to the stump a little later in the evening, thinking I might catch one in the act. A week of that, and I had not seen a raccoon. The apples were still gone, not knocked off the stump onto the ground the way a raccoon tends to do it. Gone. Taken. My second explanation was a black bear. There is bear on that property, more than the owner knows about, and a bear that had not dinned yet in early November would be eating everything it could find. A bear would take apples off a stump without much effort. I looked for sign around the base of the stump and found nothing that read clearly as bear. The ground was soft enough from a week of rain that I should have seen something, and what I saw was a scuffed area of flattened grass that was larger than a bear's track and shaped differently. I measured it against my boot. I did it twice, trying to get an honest read. My boot is a size 11. Whatever had made that impression was considerably wider and longer. I stood there for a minute, trying to think of what animal would leave that kind of mark. I could not. My third explanation was that the light was bad, and I was not reading the ground correctly. That is the one I settled on for most of the following week because it was the most comfortable, and because I had 14 years of being right about what I saw on this property, and I was not ready to be wrong about it in a way I couldn't account for. I went back to the cabin that evening and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp off, and the last of the dusk coming through the window, and I told myself, out loud, that I was a tired man reading too much into soft ground. Saying it out loud did not help as much as I had hoped. Pepper was the one who started to pull me towards something I couldn't explain away. He was 11 years old by then, and an 11-year-old brindlehound does not have a great deal of energy to waste on dramatics. He had slowed down over the previous year in the way old dogs slow down, deliberately and without apology. He still walked the property with me, but at his own pace, and he spent most evenings on the porch step in whatever warmth was left in the boards. What he had never done in 11 years was sit still and point himself at the tree line the way he began doing in October of that last year. Not alert in the way he would go when there was something to be worried about. He had a different posture for that, head low, hackles up, a particular sound that lived in his chest. This was not that. This was the posture of a dog paying close and careful attention to something that did not alarm him. His tail was low but not tucked. His ears were forward. His breathing was even. He was doing what a dog does when it is trying to understand something it has not categorized yet, but without the fear that usually comes with that. I watched him do it 3 evenings in a row before I started asking myself what he was looking at. The 4th evening, I stood beside him and looked at the tree line the way he was looking at it, and I did not see anything. The 5th evening, I stood beside him again, and this time I was quieter about it and more patient, and at the edge of what the fading light let me see. About 40 yards into the trees along the ridge path that runs north, there was a heaviness in the shadow that was not a tree. I say heaviness because I do not know a better word for it. It was not movement. It was not a shape I could define. It was a density in the dark that felt occupied in a way the rest of the dark did not. Pepper did not move. I did not move. I felt the pulse in my neck at the corner of my jaw, and I felt the cold metal of the porch railing under my palm, and I noted both of those things in the deliberate way a man notes things when he is trying to keep his thinking honest. After a while, whatever the density was not there anymore, and I could not have told you whether it had withdrawn or whether the dark had simply closed around it. I went back to the cabin and stood at the kitchen counter for a while without doing anything useful. Then I cut an apple and carried the slices down to the stump, as I always did. I remember pausing at the back door before I went out, the cold coming in around the frame, and I remember my hand on the latch a second longer than it needed to be. The next morning, the slices were gone. 3 nights later, I brought a flashlight with me at dusk when I made the walk to the stump. I laid the apple slices down and turned the light toward the tree line and held it there for a while. The light showed me nothing I could name. 40 yards of bare oak and hickory and shortleaf pine and the brush along the ground and a lot of ordinary shadow. I stood with the beam steady, my arm starting to tire, and I listened past the small mechanical hum of the flashlight and could hear nothing in the woods that was not the woods. I went back to the cabin. The apples were still gone in the morning. What I kept coming back to over those weeks was the ground beside the stump. I had been going back to it every few days, looking at it the way you look at something you want to understand. The impression I had measured was not consistent in the way an animal's repeated track is consistent. It was variable, as if whatever was making it was not always approaching from the same angle and not always putting the same amount of its weight down. But the scale of it did not change. It was always larger than anything I knew how to account for. I found a branch on the ridge path one morning in late October that had been pressed down from a height I could not reach on my toes with my arm extended. I am 6 feet even. The branch was green wood, not dead, not something the wind would have taken, and it had been pushed aside and held there and released, because it was bent at an angle that spoke of something needing to clear its head height. I measured from the ground to the crook of the bend. It was a few inches past 9 feet. I stood under that branch with my hand on the cold wood and tried to picture the body that needed to bend it, and I could not. I want to be careful here because I know what I am saying and I know how it sounds. I have been asked about this by one person in my life, the only person I have told the full version to, and what they said was that they believed me because I was not the kind of man to reach for an explanation bigger than the evidence. I try to hold to that. The branch was bent where it was bent. The ground showed what it showed. I had not seen anything fully. Not yet. That came in November. It had been 3 years to the week since Ruth died. I had not thought about that date in the weeks leading up to it the way I had thought about it the year before. The first anniversary had been hard in a way I had been braced for. The second had caught me sideways when I was not expecting it. The third arrived on a Thursday when I was patching a section of fence on the south end of the property, and I did not realize what day it was until I was on my way back to the cabin in the late afternoon, and I stopped on the ridge road and just stood there for a minute in the wind. I almost laid down right there in the gravel. I do not know what kept me upright except that there was no one to find me if I did, and so the question never quite resolved itself. And I walked the rest of the way home with my hands in my coat pockets and my breath going up in small clouds and the thought of her arriving at the kitchen door before I did. I cut the apple that evening the way I always did, 4 sections laid on the flat stone, and I walked down to the stump in the cold. It was clear that night, with a half moon coming up behind the ridgeline to the east, and the temperature had dropped enough that my breath showed. The apple was a Jonathan, slightly soft along one side, the kind Ruth had always preferred for the deer because she said the soft ones were not worth saving for pie and were too good to throw out. I laid the slices on the granite and straightened up, and Pepper, who had come down with me as he had started doing most evenings, sat down in the dead grass, 2 feet from my left boot, and was still. I did not immediately understand why I was not walking back to the cabin. Something in the air had changed. Not a smell exactly, though. There was something different in the cold. Something green and deeply earthy, like soil that has been turned up in a place that doesn't get much sun. The quality of the quiet was different, too. The property had its own sounds at that hour. Barred owls further up the ridge, the creek sound from the hollow below, whatever small things move through the leaf litter at dusk. All of that had stopped, not gradually. It had stopped the way a clock stops. I have been outdoors in the Ozark Highlands in November for 14 years. I know what the woods sound like when something large moves through them and puts everything else on hold. I had heard that before. This was something past that. This was the woods holding itself. I was looking at the stump. I kept my eyes on the stump. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 5. Pepper did not move. His breathing was the steadiest thing in the world. I could hear the small, soft pull of it, in and out, slower than mine, and I matched my breath to his without thinking about it, the way you match a metronome you are not consciously listening to. Then, at the edge of my vision to the left, about 20 feet into the trees off the north side of the stump clearing, something moved. Not fast, deliberate, the kind of movement that is choosing how much to reveal. I turned my head slowly. What I saw was enormous. That is the only word I have that holds the scale of it honestly, and even that word feels inadequate for what I am describing. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, no farther than 20 feet from where I stood, and it was upright, fully upright, and it was covered in dark fur that caught the moonlight along the shoulders and the upper arms in a way that made the rest of it seem darker by contrast. It was still in the way very large things can be still, with a weight to the stillness, a settled quality. The shoulders were broad past anything I had context for. The head was high enough above those shoulders that I had to consciously adjust my estimation of its height upward, past the first guess, past the second. Pepper sat at my boot and did not make a sound. It looked at me. I am going to say that plainly. Whatever else I cannot be certain about, I am certain about that. There was a quality to the attention that left no room for interpretation. It was looking at me the way something looks at you when it has been watching you for long enough to know something about you. And it is deciding what to do with that knowledge. The eyes caught the moonlight. They were calm. That was the word my mind kept producing. Calm. Not cautious, not uncertain. Calm in a way I associated with very old animals or with people who have been through enough that nothing surprises them anymore. We stood like that for what I can only estimate as a minute, maybe longer. I did not feel the cold. I knew the cold was there. I could feel my breath frosting at the edge of my upper lip, but the rest of my body had gone past noticing it, the way it goes when the body has decided it has more important business to attend to. Then it moved. It stepped forward, not towards me, but toward the stump, and as it stepped, I saw the full length of the stride, unhurried and deliberate, a single step that covered most of the distance between the tree line and the flat rock. It crouched. I do not have a word for how it crouched. It was not awkward. It was a fluid and considered lowering of something that was very large but not ungainly. It reached out one hand, one very large hand, and it touched the apple slices on the granite. It did not eat them. It laid its fingers across them the way you lay your hand on something you are acknowledging. The way you put your hand on the cover of a book you have not opened in a long time, or on the arm of a chair that belonged to someone who is no longer in it. There was no hunger in it. There was something else in it that I do not have a word for, but that moved through me like cold water and left me unable to do anything except stay exactly where I was. It held its hand there for a long moment. The fingers were dark and broad, and I could see, even at that distance, the small, considered way they settled, the way fingers settle when they are not just touching, but recognizing. Then it rose, slowly, and turned back toward the tree line and took 2 strides into the dark, and was gone. I stood at that stump for a while after. I could not have told you how long. Pepper pressed against my left leg and leaned his weight into me, which he had not done in months, and I put my hand on the top of his head, and we stayed there. The moon had moved a measurable amount across the sky by the time I was aware of it again, which meant we had stood there longer than I'd thought. What I felt in those minutes, I'm still not able to describe in a way that does justice to it. There was no fear in it, or none that I could locate. What there was something breaking open that had been sealed for 3 years. Not painfully, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed all winter. You feel the cold of the outside air, and it is not comfortable exactly, but it is real, and you have been missing real for so long that the discomfort of it is its own kind of relief. Ruth had fed the quiet for 8 years. She had laid those slices on that granite in all weather, in all seasons. In the mornings of the year she got sick when she was already tired in a way she was not telling me yet. And what that presence in the tree line had done was put its hand on what she had left and hold it there. That was all. It had not taken anything. It had not given anything visible. It had simply acknowledged that the thing was there, and that the offering meant something. I walked back to the cabin. I made coffee I didn't drink. The kettle whistled and I let it go on a count or two longer than I needed to before I lifted it off the burner, and the sounds seemed to belong to a different evening than the one I was standing in. I sat at the kitchen table until about 9 o'clock, and then I went to the phone on the wall. I had not called Dale in close to 2.5 years. I dialed the number. He answered on the third ring, and there was a pause before he said hello, because he had seen who it was, and was not sure what to do with that. I said, "It's your dad." He said, "I know." There was a silence, not a comfortable one. The kind of silence that is full of everything that hasn't been said in 2.5 years. I said, "I'm sorry it took me this long." He didn't answer right away. I heard him take a breath. He said, "Okay." Not forgiving exactly. Not closing the door either. Just okay, which was more than I had earned and more than I had been able to offer him, and which was, for that particular night, enough to build something on. We talked for a few minutes. Not long. Not about anything deep, not that night. He asked about Pepper. I told him Pepper was getting slower, but was good. He said he'd been thinking about coming up in the spring. I said I'd appreciate that. We said goodnight without awkwardness, and I put the phone on the hook and stood in the kitchen for a minute. And the kitchen did not feel as large as it had been feeling for 3 years. I went to bed and slept the way I had not slept in a long time. In the days that followed, I walked the property differently. I noticed I was looking at the tree line when I passed it rather than through it. I found myself going to the stump in the morning sometimes, as well as the evening, not to leave anything, just to stand there for a minute. The flat granite was always as I had left it. No impressions beside it that I could read clearly. Nothing moved. But the apples I laid out each dusk were still going in the night, and I still could not account for them by any means that satisfied the 14 years of observation I was testing them against. I reported nothing of this to the property owner. There was nothing to report in the terms we had agreed on. Nothing damaged, nothing threatening. I filed my quarterly report in December, and it read the same as every other quarterly report I had filed for 14 years. The winter passed. It was not an easy winter, but it was easier than the 2 winters before it. I called Dale twice more before spring. Both calls were longer than the first. He was making plans to drive up in April. I cleaned out the second bedroom for the first time in 3 years, which is the kind of act that sounds small and is not. I aired the quilt that had been folded at the foot of that bed, and I put fresh sheets on the mattress, and I stood in the doorway when I was done and looked at the made bed for a long time before I closed the door. Spring came up the ridge the way it always does in the Ozarks, slow and tentative at first, the redbuds going before the oaks, the creek sound changing as the snowmelt added to it up on the high end. Pepper turned 11 in March, and he was slowing further, but he was still game for the morning walk, and still went to the stump with me in the evenings. I had not told anyone about what I had seen in November. I had not tried to find words for it outside of my own head, and I found that the effort of putting it into words reduced it to something that was not the same thing as what had happened. I'm telling it now because enough time has passed that I've gotten some distance on it, and because I think a man shouldn't have to carry the whole of something like that alone. I don't have an explanation for it. I'm not going to pretend I do. I know what the branch measured. I know what the ground showed me. I know what I saw in the moonlight, the posture and the scale and the steadiness of it, the way it moved without hurry, the specific deliberateness of what it did at the stump. I know what I felt. What I have thought about most in the month since is not what the thing was. I've made my peace with not knowing that, which surprised me because I have never been comfortable with not knowing things I feel I should be able to account for. What I have thought about is the specific thing it did. It did not eat what Ruth left. It did not take what was offered. It put its hand on it. The way you acknowledge something you understand, the way you tell someone without words that you know what they were doing, and you know what it cost, and it was not lost on you. Ruth used to say that feeding the quiet was just good manners, that if something was out there in the dark going about its business, the least you could do was let it know it was seen. I think she was right, and I think it went both ways. And I think whatever was out there in those woods for those 3 years had been extending the same courtesy to her, and then to me, without either of us knowing. Dale drove up on a Saturday in April. He pulled in before noon, and we stood in the driveway for a minute, without saying much, and then I showed him the property, the south fence I had repaired, the bluff face on the north end, the 2 outbuildings. We walked more of the 600 acres than I expected we would. He had his mother's eye for the land. He noticed things I had stopped noticing. He pointed out a redbud that had come up at the corner of the south outbuilding that I would have called a weed if pressed. He stopped at the bluff face and stood with his hands in his pockets looking down at the dry creek bed for a long minute, and I let him have the minute. And when he turned back, his face was the face of a man who had been somewhere small inside himself and had come back. We ate dinner at the kitchen table, the first time there had been 2 people at that table in 3 years, and afterward we went out to the porch and watched the last of the light go off the ridge. I didn't tell him the whole story that night. I got close to it. I told him about the apples disappearing. I told him about the ground by the stump, the scale of the impression, the branch on the ridge path. He listened the way a man listens when he is deciding whether to stay with the story or find a graceful way out of it. He stayed with it. He said, "You still putting the apples out?" I said, "Every evening." He nodded. He didn't say anything for a minute, and then he said, "Mum would like that." That was all. It was enough. We sat there until it was full dark and Pepper had settled his chin on Dale's boot the way he used to do when Dale was young and would come up on visits. Dale reached down and put his hand on the old dog's back, and Pepper let out a long, slow breath. I do not know what is in those 600 acres. After 14 years, I know the property better than most people know any piece of land they have ever stood on. And I'm telling you that there is something in those woods that I have not been able to account for in any of the frameworks I have spent a working life building. I have looked at the evidence. I have applied the rational explanations in the order they occur to a man like me, and each of them has fallen short. I'm not asking anyone to believe what I saw. I am clear that what I have is my word and a bent branch and ground impressions I measured with a boot. I understand how that sounds. What I know is that something has been coming to that stump for 3 years. Something with the patience to wait and the awareness to understand what was being offered and the nature to respond to it the way it did. That is not nothing. I don't know what to call it. I've stopped needing to call it anything. The ritual goes on. Every evening I am home, I cut an apple and carry the slices down to the flat stone at the wood's edge. I lay them out the way Ruth laid them out. I stand there for a minute, in the quiet. The apples are still gone by morning. Pepper walks with me. He's 11 years old and slower than he was, but he comes, and when we stand at the stump, he looks toward the tree line with that patient, attentive stillness he's been carrying all year. I watch the tree line too. Some evenings I think about Ruth standing in this same spot in her canvas jacket, with the slices on a cracked saucer instead of in her hand. The saucer she always used for that purpose because she did not like the stickiness on her fingers. And I think about how careful she was with small things, and how that carefulness had been read by something I cannot name. I do not say her name out loud at the stump. I have not yet found the right way to do that. Maybe in time I will. The dusk takes its usual colour across the ridge, copper at the high edge and a deep settled blue down in the timber. And the cold comes up off the granite the way it always does once the sun is gone. And I stand there with my hands in my pockets and let the evening be what it is.